further develop their ideas, and we are excited to see what the final outputs will be. But more importantly, we're very excited to see what they all become in their careers, because I sense strongly that this will be the group that will be carrying the torch forward to build and grow the network. So without much further ado, I have Bali, Barbara, Alex, and Samantha. It's been an amazing journey getting to know them. So in the order of presentation, Bali will be presented first, and then afterwards Barbara, Alex, and then Samantha. So we have 10 minutes each, and then we will then convene the Q&A and to receive feedback from the audience.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I am Umbalenhle Ogwasibanda. I'm from South Africa. I'm from a township called Soweto. By profession, I'm a commercial lawyer who specializes in banking and finance law and practicing in South Africa. I'm also currently completing my LLM in commercial business law at the University of the Witwatersrand. So the title of my paper, as you can see on the screen, is The Key to Socio-Economic Sustainability in Africa, a case for developing a legislative framework for the intracontinental regulation of digital assets. When we think of speed, product diversification, a collaborative global economy, easier access to the global economy, and yes, even a dematerialization of the global economy, these are some of the phrases that come up in conversations around the fourth industrial revolution. And we can see that the fourth industrial revolution blurs the lines or merges what we know about the physical, material, the digital, as well as the sciences sectors. And it does this through different forms, including artificial intelligence, blockchain, technologies, genetic engineering, advancements in technologies, and the like. And these are all, just some of them, but these are all part of the forms that are increasingly becoming indispensable to modern day life as we know it. And the impact of this is broad. It affects even the political system, the economy, as I've just mentioned, health, and the like. So just to stick a bit on this dematerialization of the global economy, I thought it was very interesting to see, as Umberto Colombo speaks about, that the decrease in the consumption of raw materials or energy has led to a massive increase in the consumption or use of technological products. And he says it's because of the reasons that I mentioned before. So the large-scale production, the speed, the product diversification, and the like. And an interesting example that I saw from the IMF statistic, they spoke about how, and a graph there is from renewable energy, how uranium, or 1 kilogram of uranium, correlates or is the same amount as over 11,000 kilograms of oil and over 17,000 kilograms of coal. And the effect of this, for me, is the most interesting thing. It creates this global village, as people have come to call it. Right? So the idea of an information society where our borders are not the Bay Bridge border, for example, between Zim and South Africa, but now we have truly a global economy where we can access it at our fingertips. So the research was a bit extensive, but I will focus mainly on the CFTA for this purposes of time and this presentation, as well as I also looked at the approaches different African countries have followed in regulating digital assets, particularly cryptocurrency, as a payment mechanic. Nigeria and South Africa being the countries that I looked at. I also looked at other developing economies and how they are regulated for digital assets and how they are using those funds to fund sustainable economic development in their economies. But as mentioned, for the purposes of this presentation, I'll just stick to the CFTA, just mainly highlighting some of the proposed areas of improvement that I think can be introduced. So I think why I think this is important, in addition to just the scalability of a global economy, the amount of funds that is projected by the by a successful implementation of the CFTA, in my opinion, is incredible. So they speak about how 16.2 trillion will be impacted by 2050. Right, and the World Bank speaks about how 30 million people will be taken out of extreme poverty, and there will be an increase in the income of 68 million people above the poverty line. Right, so these are all, I guess, structures that the CFTA proposes to implement through its various protocols, and we'll be focusing on the digital one. But it doesn't come without challenges. And for the purposes of this specific presentation, I'm going to be dealing with the payments the payments challenges that we've seen in cross-border transactions, right? And these are the frustrations that come with the payment processes for trade of goods between countries, which I believe is a huge bottleneck, particularly as it leads to delays, high transaction costs, among other things. So what I did realize is that the CFTA doesn't expressly provide for digital assets or cryptocurrency. And I think that's a huge area of improvement. I think it can be argued that cryptocurrency can be used as a means of exchange payment to further CFTA objectives and to accelerate the goal of the CFTA, which is the integrated trade among Africa. So how are people transacting currently outside of cryptocurrency, right? So these are the traditional payment systems that we see, and they create so many challenges in the cross-border markets, including lack of access to formal banking credit services, exclusion of the unbanked population, which is a huge population in our African community, the issues that come with the Visa, the SWIFT, the FPS and PayPal, the idea that using these systems, you are susceptible to high, transaction cost delays of payments if you go by the traditional banking model. So I believe that we need to create a digital economy market that enables alternative, particularly blockchain-based digital payment systems to thrive. And I believe that this will help African states reach their objective to achieve the trade integration by implementing structures that enable business transactions to run more efficiently. An intercontinental approach to this is likely to have a more far-reaching impact, in my opinion, because now we're speaking about a joint or a shared know-how or skills and the like. Right? So just a bit on cryptocurrency. I'm not going to dwell too much on the disadvantages, not because I'm not aware of them, but I think for the purpose of this, I just want to draw light to how using cryptocurrency as an alternative virtual currency can actually benefit and solve the issue of the challenging cross-border payment systems that we see currently in the trade among our continent. So it offers secure transactions due to implementation of cryptographic protocols. Right, so it makes it difficult to counterfeit certain digital currency. There's pre-processing of payments, there's transparent transactions, transaction fees are lower than traditional banking business transactions, which I think is important if we are thinking about financial inclusion, and particularly in an African landscape where particularly the smaller businesses in the SME markets would not have the financial resources to operate their companies in the normal course, and also attend to all these exorbitant transaction fees. It's also available to anyone with a smartphone, and I think in the digital age that we're living in, more and more people have and less people don't, right? So it's available to everyone regardless of demographics, whereas the traditional banking model will require you to have certain, meet certain criteria or be within a certain area. I know in South Africa, for example, there are certain areas, particularly in the rural landscape, that may not have a bank, and you'd have to travel, long distances to get to a bank, for example, whereas with this option, really anyone has access to it.
2 minutes.
2 minutes left. So I'm just going to just jump straight to the areas of improvement and why I believe digital assets fast-track our integration in intercontinental trade markets. I think, as I mentioned, using cryptocurrency as an alternative virtual currency, in my opinion, it's a means of exchange of payment to further the CFTA's objective to accelerate international trade. Unlike the traditional banking systems, cryptocurrency offers instant payment mechanisms, right? And I think that is crucial. And I think it can be argued that this can be our closest alternative to a single pan-African currency viable across the continent. And when we look at the CFTA and the STISA policy and how that can be improved, I think policy makers should advocate for an intra-continental regulated crypto market that will ensure a uniform approach to the regulation of digital assets. We're not uniformed in the sense that there is regulation across Africa, but really more necessarily around the same objectives, right? So I believe that they should ensure that the policies have an emphasis on consumer protection and enforcement, because that's usually the deterrent when conversations around cryptocurrency are introduced, and that is the biggest deterrent against investing in digital assets. It relates to the lack of information and susceptibility of fraud. And in this regard, I believe that the STSA can introduce digital asset literacy programs to be rolled out across the continent with a focus specifically on investors and policymakers. And the idea is that each investor may be required to complete a training course. These are more practical examples where they actually get to unpack the consequences that come with failed or risks in the digital asset markets. An additional way to mitigate the risk would be to establish agencies that monitor bodies that monitor intercontinental trade of digital assets for unlawful activities. So as well investigating as well as issue enforcement guided notes for entities within necessary jurisdiction, and I think that is where the gap is currently in this market. In future, I think that the STIC could consider an intra-Africa body, as I mentioned, whose function will be to report the regulation of digital assets across the continent. And the body could also partner up with digital innovators to create safer and more efficient systems to support the digital asset markets. I think there's also space for an African digital bank that will perform a similar function to our traditional banks, but on a digital landscape as well. I think just to wrap up, I think what I hope to put across is that digitalization of technology has the potential to accelerate our development as a continent at a much faster rate than other industrial revolutions have done. And I think it can actually place us in a position where we become a formidable competitor in the economy. But it has to be done in a way where it is regulated to mitigate the risks without thwarting the impact of a thriving digital innovation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. This sets the next presentation of Barbara, because there's something you mentioned about digital literacy. And Barbara will be talking about informal cross-border trade, women and vulnerabilities, parity that is attached to this particular type of trade. Literacy has been a major issue in this regard. Recently, we attended a launch by USAID and MasterCard with plans to push digital literacy on the African continent, and I view this with suspicion because after the literacy comes access to this market. So a lot of questions about the STISA. I wonder what role African institutions will play in these interactions. Barbara, we are ready when you're ready.
Morning, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Prof, as well. I was expecting guest people today, but we're here now. Just also thank you for this platform as well as young and emerging scholars. Really here to learn more and to grow in that aspect. So my title of my paper is The Informal Economy and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, Navigating the Way Forward and Prioritizing a Gender-Sensitive Approach to Trade in Africa. And I'm mainly specifically looking at informal cross-border trading, what that actually looks like, why it is unregulated, and why as well are women so invisible and yet they're contributing so much to the economy in Africa. So the aims of this paper is to interrogate protection frameworks required for facilitating cross-border trading in Africa while incorporating a gender-sensitive informal cross-border trading, which forms a large part of the economy, and then a critical analysis as well into trade and gender, and as well as a review of the role of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement in enabling the standardization of gender-sensitive trade policy in Africa, and how this is conducted. Is it conducted and how is it conducted? An assessment on how informal cross-border trading can be utilized to promote equality, non-discrimination, and improve the standards of living for women is actually very necessary to actually reinforce that feminization of trade. So this is what the aims of this paper actually looks like, because we see from informal cross-border trading as well that the African continent has enormous potential for trade with the global market as well as intra-African trade. But firstly, I'll just do a brief recap about the African the AfTA in terms of how it was officially entered into force in 2019. And the scope of this agreement requires AU member states to progressively remove tariffs on intra-African trade, making it easier for African countries to trade within the continent. And this is something that we don't see in terms of informal cross-border trading, that how are they actually removing this tariffs as much as they want to transition from informal to formalization of trade. And then it creates a liberalized continental market for goods and services, and this is really speaking on the trade liberalization and how we need to have a liberalized continental market for goods and services. The AfTA also seeks to provide a single market for goods, services, investment, intellectual property rights, and competition policies as well. And this is very covered by the agreement and is officially recognized by governments and have acceded to this agreement. But also looking into have the governments actually acceded to what is presented in this agreement. So it covers areas such as trade facilitation and services, and regulatory measures such as technical barriers to trade and sanitary standards. So as I was saying, that the African continent has enormous potential for trade with the global markets as well as intra-African trade. And intra-African trade is vital in diversifying economies and promoting development. And so we see the definition as well for informal cross-border trading, which is defined as trade between neighboring countries conducted by vulnerable, small, unregistered traders. And so we see that it contributes prominently to the economies of African states, and SADC defines it as businesses operating in goods and services that trade across the border with no official export or import license or permit within a defined threshold and frequency as well. And so it's regarded as illegal, and this is very problematic for me in terms of how it's regarded as an illegal commercialization of cross-border trade activities. And this is something that can lead us into discussing in terms of how historically informal cross-border trading reflects the long-standing relationships and indigenous patterns which have predated to colonial times and post-colonial state borders. So it was conducted between people of the same clan and ethnicity, but is now actually being viewed as illegal. And something that Prof. Christian Nshimbi talks about is that informality is actually not new to Africa. And the notion itself is very problematic to describe it as informal, because now we're talking about and referring it to as illegal, underground, as well as a black market or shadow economy, which is a misconception that exists in terms of equating the informal equality to being illegal, clandestine, and also criminal activities. And this is what they actually have, the misconception that all of them are actually engaging in criminal activities. So to just really note that this is actually supposed to be considered as the most important source of employment among self-employed women, who represent 60% of non-agricultural self-employment. So some of the statistics here, time flies. Some of the statistics here is that the informal sector involves economic activity that is not registered, regulated, or protected by existing legal or regulatory frameworks. In Africa, I saw this recent statistics that 85% of the population is actually engaged in informal labor. And so we're making it a region that has the largest share of workforce in the informal sector and actually contributes to 62% of the GDP. So we see that it actually, the statistics is that that given its critical potential for generating significant income and catalyzing value chain creation and the livelihoods of women and families involved, it actually needs to be properly supported. And that's essentially what I'm looking at in this research. So I'm just going to get into the challenges faced by women in ICBT, and I think it's also important to look at it in an intersectional lens in terms of race and gender and class are intertwined, and what we actually see is that women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who are experiencing poverty have restricted access to education, unstable employment, in terms of that as well, in terms of why they get into ICBT in terms of that. So I think when you're looking at that, there needs to be looking at the issues in such an intersectional lens. So when you're looking at the challenges faced by women in ICBTs, that I need us to note that women actually play an important role in trade in Africa, and they're essential for regional development. And so many women cross borders in Africa to deliver goods from where they are affordable to areas where they are actually in short supply. And it's actually seen that some of these women, when they get into ICBT, it's not because of a voluntary factors, but they're due to many reasons, such as lack of opportunities, access to the formal economy are also seen in terms of just how it's hard to get into the formal economy because of those lack of access to opportunities. And they also experience financial exclusion, high tariff fees, poverty, and more. And so they also face many challenges. I actually will just highlight these 3 challenges. But they face challenges such as discrimination, inequality, stigmatization, sexual violence, harassment, poor living and working conditions, and suffer that of lack of visibility. So the 3 challenges that I look at is the gender constraints, border obstacles, gender-based violence, and crime. And when we're actually looking at intersectionality, we need to just note that gender inequality is a deciding element in terms of this. So when we look at gendered constraints, we're looking at the fact that they're excluded from resources. There's a limited access to markets, finance, and credit, and that hampers them from the available regional and national initiatives to enhance trade in Africa. They struggle to find profitable markets beyond occasional street selling in border areas. So there's a struggle to actually access these credit and finance for women traders, especially seen in terms of how there's just institutional discrimination. And we were really talking about the institutional, in terms of the financial institutional basis, in that who is it for? So there's a struggle for them to actually find profitable ways to ensure that they actually have good working and living conditions, and then they actually resort to just occasional street selling in border areas. And so there's a lack of financial information that also exists, and low levels of financial literacy, and this is something we need to actually look at in terms of that as well for women in ICBT to be assisted. When it comes to gender-based violence and crime, we really see that they really are forced to engage in transactional sexual activities at the borders as well, and for them to obtain accommodation, transport, or to actually cross the borders. And so we see a lot of sexual violence from even custom officials at the borders. And we see that there's just a lack of safety and security at the borders, and because of language barriers, they can face that xenophobia and be actually taken advantage of in terms of that. But because of lack of standardized laws, then there actually isn't much safety and security for them in terms of that. And this was actually exacerbated with COVID-19 when we saw that there was a change in the operating times at the border posts, and so they had to sleep at the borders, and that actually leads to them being taken advantage of in terms of that as well. And because of the lack of standardized laws, they can't really go and report the sexual-based violence that they face. And because they're seen as illegal, now to go and report it can actually make it worse for them. The border obstacles as well, we see that there's extensive documentation requirements at the border, complex border procedures as well in terms of that, and it's really difficult as well to capture the trading activities because it's not documented well at the borders, and the duties that are paid at the borders are too high. There's weak law enforcement, and corruption is very rife at the borders. Sometimes these women are required to actually are required to actually pay the tariffs at the borders more than the goods that they actually are at. I am concluding. But I just want us to look at this quote that I saw, that the failure to mainstream the informal economy in the after makes the African Free Trade Agreement look like, to use a house metaphor, a beautifully constructed house located in the wrong neighborhood. But I also just see it as the fact that we're building a house, but we're actually making women stay at the backyard in terms of just now advocating for another protocol that is actually not mainstreaming the after. And so now we're building this beautiful constructed house, but women are actually outside and looking at that house being constructed. Why is it not explicitly mentioned in the after, as well as the regional architecture, that there are gaps in it as well? Because of time, I really cannot get into the gaps in full, but just really in terms of the text of the after agreement, the simplified trade regime, and the protocol on women and youth as well. And we see the efforts that are being made as well in terms of the COMESA gender policy, which is something that I also just discussed, and how they actually want to encourage that of the simplified trade regime as well. We just really see the lack of political will, lack of harmonized laws, and some of these regional architectures act as a lip service in terms of and not actually being implemented in terms of that. Prof keeps looking at me. But just recommendations. There's a recommendation that I just want to just center on. I won't look at all of them, but recommendations that the transitioning from formalization into informal and from informal to formalization, which is quite problematic because sometimes the governments want to just chip into this as well. In terms of that, but I think that if we're going to really look at formalizing, that we need to actually look at reformation and transformation in terms of how the misconception of what actually informal cross-border trading is. And so if our texts and our laws do not advocate in protecting these women as well, then what are we really doing in terms of that? So there needs to be a change in the perception, firstly, of informal cross-border trading by governance. And then we need to look at the simplified trade regimes, education, because that is lacking. And I conclude. This is just my conclusion.
You've said enough.
Yes.
People are looking forward to reading your paper, and I know you have questions in the room already. I can see some people smiling, and it reminds me so much of the budgets and Luan's presentation from yesterday. Trust me, you're going to have loads of questions based on what you've already said, and we're looking forward to reading them. Thank you so much. And you're so passionate you are about this, so I think if we left you, you would really school us here on this for an hour or more. Alex.
My name is Alex Tame. I'm a final year undergraduate student of law at Kabarak University, and this is my presentation. And I must very duly admit that now I'm feeling a bit shaky in my shoes because my co-panelists who went before me did such in-depth studies into their topics, and I very frankly admit that my consideration was somewhat banal in that I was asking myself a very simple question. We have so many integration initiatives in and across Africa. They've been trying to achieve grand goals, but so few of them have come into fruition. The Abuja Treaty is locked in a cupboard somewhere, not doing much. And I started to ask myself a question of why is that? Well, so this is supposed to be much more fun. I was going to show you a photo of 8-9-year-old boy, and that was the ground where I, at the back of my head, started thinking about this. And the question was how I came into contact with integration personally, because it's always been in my experience that when you start thinking from the point of logic, you need first principles. And I, for the longest time, believed that scientists, in a sense, even social scientists, or people who purport to play the game as social scientists, need first principles. But for most things, your first principle can only ever be yourself. You need to ground yourself in your own subjective experience first before you start analyzing something. So mine was very simple. When I was around somewhere between 8 and 10 years old, I was in primary school, and the East African community rolled out a new anthem. It was a Monday morning, and every Monday morning, as Kenyan schools are wont to do, I don't know what the schools in the rest of your countries, we had assembly, where you come, you say the Pledge of Allegiance, you raise the Kenyan flag, but suddenly we had a second flag out of nowhere. It was a peculiar green thing. We had a second flag out of nowhere, and we had a sound system at the assembly next to us, and they were playing an anthem. An anthem that we'd never heard of, so they had to play it from a sound system. The anthem was the East African Community Anthem. And for most of the years, until just recently when I was finishing high school, yes, I'm a child. When I was finishing high school is when now we finally started learning it and internalizing it, now singing the anthem ourselves. That was like some 5 or so years ago. And that got me to thinking, they had not considered the people they made this anthem for. And that's just yes, that's the photo of 8-year-old boys I was supposed to, I was going to show you. That's the age where it all started spooling into a weird in my mind. And so it all came to a fore somewhere last year when my friend in the academic forum called me and he gave me this book. He's like, our most distinguished professor has written something absolutely amazing. I think you should write and critique it and view it. And I read it and it all made so much sense. He was looking at regional integration on the continent from a matter of supranationality. The thesis, if I could understand it really in one statement, is enhancing the supranational powers of regional integration institutions would enable integration to happen much better on a more wholesale level, on a much larger scale. And this was some of the proposals. He said, endowing sort of like the PAP with legislative powers, above what it already has, with some binding nature to that. Same for the African Court, the African Commission, broader institutional realignment, investing in bottom-up continental regional integration initiatives, and creating room for civil society to participate. So raise the ceiling by increasing the supranational powers of institutions that already exist, and then raise up the ability of the common citizen in every state in Africa to engage with these institutions, such that states are just no longer able to impede integration on a certain level. But now I came to thinking that this need not necessarily work. And here's why. This is my framework of thought. It's called the theory of constraint. It's something utilized in, it's a concept from management thinking, and it's very simple. The first core principle is every system has at least one constraint limiting its performance. The system's overall throughput is determined by its constraints. Improving non-constraints won't significantly help overall performance. It seems a bit abstract, so I'm just going to use a practical example to bring it all in. Let's imagine cooking dinner. And what we're cooking is oven-baked beef and oven-baked potatoes. So everything is being used in an oven. Your system is the interconnectedness of all of those pieces, right? You need to prepare and serve the baked potatoes, you need to oven roast the beef, and you need to ensure that it gets served in time, otherwise you're going to get some very serious glares. So what are your constraints? You need to chop one of the vegetables for your potatoes. Let's say you're going to have them made in a certain type of French way. It's a very time-consuming process, and remember, both of these dishes, and maybe any attendant dishes, need to use the oven, but the oven can only do one dish at a time. And for those of you who've roasted meat with an oven, you know it takes quite a bit of time. You need to check consistencies, put it back twice or thrice. How are you going to make the dishes on time and make sure that you do not have your guests that you've invited to your home glaring at you, right? And that's the lesson we learn from our food analogy. You need to identify the tightest bottleneck. So you could get more helpers. You could get more helpers to help you chop up the meat, chop up the potatoes, prepare everything, but the oven is still one. It's still going to have our most time-consuming. It's still going to be very It's still going to be very time-consuming, because you still need to wait for all the dishes to cook. You can try and prepare everything in advance, store them in the fridge maybe 2 days before, but the oven is still one. And thus you can't make any significant progress because your tightest bottleneck has not been addressed. Now, if you decided to shift the dishes to maybe one is being cooked on a stove and the other is being cooked in an oven, then maybe you shifted your tightest constraint. But without addressing your tightest constraint, then you cannot really do anything. And now we apply that to our circumstances. I think that the lack of a unified will is the tightest bottleneck on all integrationist efforts in Africa. I think that is, to me, it's in a sense self-explanatory, because everything political is an extension of human will. Political institutions, states themselves, are amalgams of human will to extend it beyond what we could as individuals. And so no matter how much we work at integration, without a conscious will to unification and integration, no amount of hardware rearrangement. This is what I'm referring to as hardware rearrangement. My teacher's Professor Babatunde's most astute ideas on realigning the framework, I feel they couldn't work if you did not get down to fixing these things called mental models. So what are mental models? Douglas North has a very well-placed definition of mental models. They're simply the internal representations that individual cognitive systems create to interpret the environment. Institutions are the external mechanisms individuals create to structure and order the environment. And in this simple quote, you can see the relationship between mental models and the creation of institutions. So if you have defunct mental models, then by any means whatsoever, you either have defunct institutions, or if you have well-designed institutions, they are not aligned with your mental models, there's going to be a certain torsion, and they're not going to work. And I think that's what's been happening in Africa, right? The perceptions of policy and lawmakers on the position that regional integration has, like beyond the trade liberalization paradigm, like post-AfCFTA, then if they're not thinking to that level, it's a conversation I was having with my teacher, Mr. Sipala, before he came here, and he likes so much to refer to the Chinese in that they gain things, this is his words verbatim, they gain things on a 300, 400 year time frame. Right? And you can only gain things in your mind on that level, on a purely subjective level, and then it's going to bleed out into the intersubjective and affect your institutional design, right? And if you don't have the mental models to do that, then who's to say the AfCFTA is even going to reach 2063 in its actual function? Remember, we had the Millennium Development Goals; those were scrapped, and then we have the Sustainable Development Goals. Those are seeming like they're going to be scrapped, and then we're going to have another type of development goal saying the same things, right? Because the mental model didn't have that far an outlook into the future. So I was going a bit more in depth into mental models, but time. So let me just skip that. So how does this apply to AfCFTA implementation? So throughout the conference, I've been listening to the questions people are asking themselves. And it ties into, this is lifted directly from my paper. On the topic of the AfCFTA, a survey, by Afrobarometer shows the continent is generally split. People are skeptical on a very primal cognitive level. The title, I just saw it fit to lift the title of the survey itself. It says, beyond borders, Africans prefer self-reliant development and remain skeptical of free trade and open borders, right? And that's a mental model problem. It's not an institutional problem, it's not a sensitization problem, it's a mental model problem, and it's clear in all of us. And then some of the questions I lifted from the conference, Professor Tola asked, women as only small-scale traders, really? Really? It's not an institutional problem, it's not a structural design problem, it's a mental model problem. If you do not think as women as active participants with agency, power, and ability to effect significant enough magnitude of trade in the African continental free trade area system on a cognitive level, on a thinking level, how is that going to replicate itself in regional integration? Professor Saudin Mokaje, he was asking, integration for who? By who? Right? And he gave his very hilarious onion story. And it's like, we're having very grand goals, but people are not even thinking past the level of getting a few onions past the market in Tanga or Endai. For who and by who, right? Dean Bolden's entire presentation actually stuck out to me on diversity, inclusion, and equity. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, I think it was. And that itself seems interrogation of mental model, something lying deeper than the institutional design itself. The panel on teaching law, I think you were just actively trying to solve that problem. Kaniri on talking about GIs and Muratino. It's like what he's trying to use, it was in the vein of intellectual property law, but in essence he was trying to overhaul the mental models that had been embedded in us and solidified through law on traditional brews. And from the prior conference, the online Afronomics conference, I asked a question specifically on the AFCFT to Professor Caroline Kube, who was giving the keynote speech, and I said, what is going to be the biggest problem? She said political will. What is political will except the cognitive will of individuals to do this? And I'm just going to read this quote by Fran. Don't worry, Professor, I'm finishing. It's a minute and a half or two. So I'm just going to read this quote by Franz Fanon. At whatever level we study it, individual encounters, a change of name for a sports club, the guest list at a cocktail party, members of a police force or the board of directors of a state or private bank, decolonization is quite simply the substitution of one species of mankind by another. The substitution is unconditional, it's absolute, it's total, and it's seamless. How does this tie into the next? We need to foster a transcendental will. Pan-Africanism by any name so called. So in my paper I say Pan-Africanism as we understand it is, as a mental model anyway, is dead, right? And with bold claims, I make it on behalf of some of my generation. As you can see, we are want to vehemently deny, so they might lynch me when I get back home as well. But that's why I said by any name so called. I don't know what it could be called, I don't know what it could look like. But I know what it needs to be, and it needs to be forward-looking, it needs to be long-stretched, and it needs to centralize the ideals of the entire continent. And to some extent, this is what's happening with my generation in the country, as you can see, going against problems that have been inflicted upon us by leadership, austerity measures, and whatnot. The next is the utility of music and art. And I would have loved to read this passage, but anyway, so that there is Hugh Masekela, the legend from South Africa, and that is Isaiah Katumwa, an excellent, absolutely amazing saxophonist from Uganda. And they are playing in Kenya at the Jazz Festival. I think it was 2018, that was before the legend Hugh Masekela passed away. And it goes to show people came from several neighboring countries just to see this show, right? And there's the music festival that's been going on for, I don't know if it's still going on for at least like 30 years in Würzburg, with a similar ethos, right? And people, you can hardly ever understand what you're listening to, but the communication goes beyond language. It cuts beyond the political morass. It cuts beyond all our ethnic and state divides. And maybe it has some utility. And that's just for comic relief. It's Angukanaga. And my final facet of in lieu of solutions is culturally appropriate education. As you can see, it's very, it's a bit all over the place. I intended it to look like that because I'm still thinking on it, and instead of trying to provide solutions to professors, I'm just trying to spark thought. Like my views on music, for example, came from Professor Babatunde's use of music in teaching international law. Use of Fela Kuti's music. He has a beautiful blog piece called Ballads of Dissent, where he talks about Burna Boy's music. My own teacher of international law likes to start his blogs with, there's a series of blogs he did for Afronomics, starting with banning spear lyrics. And yeah, that's Ballads of Dissent. So music in its utility for culturally appropriate education, and of course we need a historically grounded education. That's what Professor Thomas was mentioning, because again, a system of characteristic of the colonial system is erasure. It's erasure, it's a replacement seamless, and decolonization needs to be a replacement, again seamless, of what has been imposed for us to back to. And finally, honoring your elders. This is a musing coming from a section in our student law journal at Kabara, where we have taken it upon ourselves to study prolific African scholars. So far we have done T.O. Elias, T.O. Elias, and Bonaya Godana, and we're doing further iterations this year, Shatra Kunto, Mshiramungo, and creating more platforms for educational engagement. That's why I was so excited having a conversation with Prof. Gandhi on the same.
Trying to relax.
And I shall finish with a quote. Last slide, I promise, Professor. I apologize. I'm not going to occupy too much today. So this is a quote from the Whole Earth Catalog, and it says, "We are as gods, and we might as well get good at it." What does that mean? Is we have taken unto ourselves to reshape this planet into whatever we would make of it. Let's not mess it up.
Thank you very much. Questions? Samantha?
Good morning, everyone. I literally have 5 slides, and I think it's 4 to be true, and because the 5th one is a thank you, so literally. But my topic is from agreement to implementation, a review of the strategies available for African countries for the successful implementation of the AfCFTA. Money makes the world go round, and that is exactly what I'm going to be looking at, trade finance. For us to have the house that Barbara was talking about, to build the AfCFTA house, we need money. Where do we get that money from? And so you'll find that when you're looking at trade finance, it's very important for us to contextualize the context in which we find Africa when we're talking about the AfCFTA. And so, right, so, sorry about that. So I contextualize the context in which we talk about Africa when we're talking about the AfCFTA. And so it's very important for us to look at the global financial architecture, because we need to understand that Africa is what Dr. Harrison Boy was talking about yesterday. When we look at the global south, of which Africa is part of, it is heavily subordinated to the global north. And so already we have a discrepancy there. And so we need to find more ways to ensure that we finance ourselves, we finance the trade that we want to see within the African continent. And so one of them is tax. I'll start with tax. And tax, as we know, we heavily tax as citizens in our various African countries. We know of the Kenya case that is happening at the present moment. And I'll refer to Winston Churchill's quote where he says, can a country tax itself into prosperity? And the answer is no, because he says it's like standing in a bucket and trying to lift yourself by the handle. So tax already is not working for us to then try and finance our trade. So maybe the next step will be looking into debt. But again, we're heavily indebted as African countries. We hardly can facilitate for our education and healthcare and all of those socioeconomic rights. And so, again, that is not a viable option. We look at natural resource governance. Most of our countries are naturally endowed with natural resources. I come from Zimbabwe, and we have lithium, and you know lithium is actually on high demand. It is the metal that is used for your phones, your batteries, your laptops, and all of that. And so, can we look inward and maybe look at domestic resource mobilization and use our minerals to then finance our trade? There's corruption, there's less financial flows, and so that is more of an us problem. We're not really good at our accountability and transparency mechanisms. And so it makes it difficult for us then to trade, to finance our trade, because the options that we have are not really working for us. So because the options that we have are not working for us, we then experience different challenges. And I just pick three because I don't have much time. But we have passive restrictions where we have logistics and transportation problems, where we have problems moving goods from one country to the other because of non-tariff barriers, for example. And so that is one other problem. And also we have movement of persons. We were talking about it yesterday when we were saying it's very difficult for one person to move from another country. Visa issues. I remember Faith highlighting Kenya. Kenya is like, oh, no, you don't need a visa anymore. But you do need a visa. It's an e-visa and you pay something like $40. So really, we have problems with passive restrictions over there. We look at unfavorable tax regimes. Again, I was talking about the taxation systems that we have in our countries. They're not working for us. And you'll find the most affected in this by these unfavorable tax regimes would be your women and your young people, because they're the most they're the most of the population that contributes more to informal trade, for example. They also contribute to micro, small, and medium enterprises. Enterprises. So the SMEs are also affected by those unfavorable tax regimes. And so would we expect them, women and young people and every other citizen, to be able then to participate at an intercontinental level if they are unable to participate in their own individual countries? I don't think so. We look at unfair competition. Now, at a continental level, everyone is just trying to do something. Every other country is just trying to do something. And I'll give an example. Ivory Coast, we know Ivory Coast is the largest producer of cashew nuts. And this is not just on the African continent, but this is also in the whole world. We know Nigeria, for example, largest producer of oil. Zimbabwe, we're the largest producer of the lithium metal that we're talking about. So, are we then able to trade in this Africa, the SFTA? No, because there are unfair competition laws that are there, and so maybe we also need to look at the competition laws that will be governing and regulating the space. So my proposals are: let's apply an African philosophical approach to the economics of trade, and that starts by the reform of the global financial architecture. And the African Development Bank was in Nairobi, I think around May. They were talking about how do we design an African financial architecture, for example. And that's one other thing. Do you want financial institutions being the ones leading on these discussions, or do you want us as citizens, maybe represented by society organizations, voicing our concerns and determining how we envision an African financial architecture would look like? Then we need to maximize on the risks. Because we already have these institutions, we have this infrastructure already in place, but you'll find that 4 out of the 8 are the ones who are practicing free trade. And so maybe we need to revise that as well, to have all of the 8 participating in the free trade. Then we need to strengthen compliance mechanisms like the non-tariff barriers so that we enhance the implementation of the AfIELN. This would also make it simpler for merchants to report NTVs and for officials to then also monitor and address them. Then competitive advantage principle. I was talking about Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, as well as Zimbabwe. If each and every country was to focus on one thing that they're really good at, then maybe they'll be able to neutralize competition and then just focus on that and then be at the top of their game. Then the last one, the promotion of a favorable tax regime, one that is gender sensitive and responsive. When you're looking at designing a policy mechanism or policy and development structure, you always need to be conscious of the gender biases. And so it's very important for us to then have one tax regime that is gender sensitive and responsive, and that also confirms the gender biases and ensures that there is equality and equity. And I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha. What about the division of time for us? So it's supposed to be an hour. We started about 5 minutes late. So technically, we have just about at the top 10 minutes for questions. So, okay, yeah, hands will flying off. Guys, get ready. So we're following the format we established from last day. So we take. What we'll do is we'll take the questions from that table. The back where we have Bill Baldwin, Ross, and Jenny.
Thank you so much. Very informative, great presentations. I'm just going to read off the questions that I have, and you feel free to answer which one you when you came in, when I came in, you were talking, so I missed your name. But how do you propose that the AfCFTA can regulate digital currency if we have all of the challenges already with cryptocurrency and the problems with its value? Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. How do you propose that that's better than something like Cash App or Zelle or PayPal and those things? Barbara, if 80% of the economy is informal, why do you suppose it's not included in the AfCFTA? And of that 80%, I think that's the number you gave, what percentage is women? And how are you looking at intersectionality with regard to the oppression involved, particularly because intersectionality, of course, is a little bit different for US women than it would be for African women. Alex, way above my pay grade, but I looked at a question. If we have competing mental models, right, because each country has their own self-interest, how can we overcome unconscious bias even under a super nationalist theory in instituting policies under the AfCFTA? And then lastly, Samantha, so would you be opposed, as recommended by your colleague, to include informal trade? Would you be opposed to inclusion of informal trade within considerations of the AfCFTA? Thank you.
Thank you for the presentations. I have one question for Barbara. One of the recommendations was transition from informalization to formalization. And I know this is because of time, but I'm very interested. But I have questions. What does this look like? What action points are we looking at? I know you've thought this through a bit more. So what avenues are we working with to do this? Just trying to understand your perspectives on how this transition will look like, or what that means exactly. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much for excellent presentations. I have a question to Alex and Barbara. What do you think? Are more jobs being created by trade liberalization or by trade barriers? Why I'm asking? There is a town at the Ugandan-Kenyan border called Busia, which is cut through the border. And the East African community erected there a one-stop border post. And I thought that people would love it, people in Busia, but people in Busia hate it. Why? Because they were making money with the bureaucratic system that was there in place. There was an army of agents, facilitators, who were helping traders to overcome their bureaucratic obstacles. So the bureaucratic obstacles to trade were creating jobs. So once they were eliminated, the jobs were lost. So the situation people in Busia found themselves in was that the jobs that the barriers to trade created were lost, and the small-scale traders that actually do their business across the border are oppressed. Thank you.
And in particular, the out-of-the-box thinking in the presentations in a very interdisciplinary and challenging way. So Barbara, I'm very happy to pass on some data, some of the latest data that actually supports many of the propositions that you have that you are talking about in terms of the numbers, the underestimated levels of informal cross-border trade. There's a very big debate going on now within the AfCFTA and the United Nations Economic Commission on Africa, because the way that the data is reported is not represented in the formal documents. But we have a guy called Andrew Moll that has come up with this data, and I think you should have access to it. For Alex, I think my challenge to you is, Douglas North and his work is very ahistorical. So he has other books like The Rise of the Western World and things like that. And sort of, I feel like, he has built a lot of castles in the air that don't connect to history at all. And so I wonder how you connect that. And Balande, I thought that your paper fits very well along with the papers yesterday, the PAPS, the papers in the PAPS session, and maybe the organizers of this conference might think how to have these papers speak to each other and combine, because they can contribute quite a bit. And Samantha, I think your focus on the African financial architecture is really great, and we need more work like this that tells us what Africa can do. But also this ties to a lot of the other papers that have been presented. So these themes that are coming out really strongly, I hope the conference organizers, when they publish the book, we shall sort of be learning from all this important new work.
Barbara, I think, well, I really enjoyed your paper. I was wondering whether you considered also a different form of informal corporate trading services, because you mentioned a lot of barriers that women face in corporate trade in goods. So I would like you to probably take time to also include in your analysis the services barriers. And a follow-up question is whether you would really comment that some of these services should be formalized. Because again, the nature of the trade of certain services might go on that they remain in the United States. So you should also really think about that as well. And for Samantha, you kind of mentioned at some point in your presentation that you mentioned a sort of competitive advantage or maybe comparative advantage. Do you think, of course, many countries produce the same thing, and that's also one of the challenges why the volume of trade in South Africa actually is really reduced. So, what have you identified as potential strength between African countries which they should focus on? For you identify certain products which you think the countries should really focus on, and then make sure that the trade actually is realized. Thank you.
I think Prof. Nshimbi talks about inclusive formalization in terms of that there needs to be a formal recognition that's done by government authorities of ICBTs first in terms of that. So that is actually very important, and the perception as well that needs to be changed. I think it's a bit hard to see women that are in this, which is very surprising because there is a notion that men actually think that they rule this informal cross-border trading, and women should not be able to be included in terms of informal cross-border trading. So there's a patriarchal mindset towards informal cross-border trading, but they make up more of that in terms of that. But how to use intersectionality, I think that was also a comment that I got into the paper in terms of looking at an intersectional, multidimensional lens in terms of the issues that women are actually facing, which is something that I will look at. So my answer is I will look into this. Janet, thank you so much for this question. I think this is something that I knew was going to also raise a lot of eyebrows in terms of transitioning from informal to formalization. I must say that I'm not for formalization, not right now actually, but in terms of how does this look like, I think Prof. Nshimbi talks about inclusive formalization in terms of that there needs to be a formal recognition that's done by government authorities of ICBTs first in terms of that. So that is actually very important, and the perception as well that needs to be changed. I think it's a bit hard to see how you can change the mindsets of government in terms of that as well, of their perceptions of ICBTs. And that really talks about in terms of how SADC is also against the informal cross-border trading and actually is more for formalization, but it's because they want a chip into it, as they always do. And the SADC is always just the really, I think Prof. Nshimbi was talking about it really being for them, the global economy being about them, and just being a club of politicians as well, which is something that needs to be looked at in terms of how does it look like and how can we actually put them in the room and to sort that out as well. Prof. Thomas, I think I need to also look in terms of that, in terms of more jobs being created through trade liberalization of trade barriers. I think that's very interesting. So I also will look into that in terms of that. And then thank you so much, Prof. Kati. I also look into the comment that you gave me and the scholar that you also gave me in terms of that. Regis, I also, in terms of should they be formalized, like I said, I think that I'm not really there as yet in terms of formalization. I think that there's a lack of understanding in terms of how does this look like and will there be inclusion in terms of that as well. But I will also look at the data of ICBT in services. Thank you.
Okay. So on Dean Baldwin's question on how to reconcile competing mental models and unconscious bias, that's what I understood, yes? For me, it seems simple but not easy in that just make it, allow their interaction and just take what comes. And there's going to be a certain autochthony and thus legitimacy to whatever comes, because cultures are wont to do exactly that. They amalgamate, they propagate, they fissure, and then they come together again, and they adapt to what is needed to a certain circumstance, right? And so now that's the question I'm also asking myself. How now do you allow them to communicate? How do you allow the individuals at every single level to communicate? And how do you allow that communication, how do you give that communication meaning? Because I think that's also the problem that's going on with my country as it stands. It feels like it's the state, the government, against the people, right? And it's a breakdown in communication and interaction. And even when communication finally happens, it feels like one party is not listening, and that's no way to have a conversation. So that's the tangent of thought I'm on right now, how to create those conversations at every single level of a civilization, and then how to drive those towards harmony instead of towards fissuring. And on the second question by Professor Thomas, are more jobs being created by trade liberalization or by trade barriers? So interesting tidbit, I'm from Busia on my mother's side. So I've been there. A cousin of mine tried to sneak me across the border, but that's beside the point. So anyway, and my answer is it's a relatively simple one. It's an equivocal yes, more jobs are being created by trade liberalization than by trade barriers. And not liberalization as a matter of policy, not liberalization as a matter of institutionalization, just liberalization as of a matter that for the past 100 years, the world has been shrinking by expansion, right? And in my own lived experiences, for the time where I had different story, refused to go to campus, I was working for a white man. Doing writing jobs, working for someone in Morocco doing other jobs, and then at the same time working at home, all in the same day. And liberalization in the sense that the world has already shrunk by expansion. It's not something you can. It's not something you can avoid. And law and policy is just trying to catch up and regulate. So my answer is an unequivocal yes on more jobs being created by trade liberalization, but not trade liberalization as a matter of policy. And Professor Gandhi, I will most definitely look into more of Douglas North's work. Thank you for that comment.
Thank you. I had a question. Would I be opposed to the inclusion of informal trade? I would not be opposed. Statistics already tell us that 70% of informal cross-border trade is actually contributed by women. And so it's very important for us to have women in the conversation. And that is one of the things that I was highlighting in my paper, the important role of of women and the youth. And the other question was on a competitive advantage. One country that I did mention was Zimbabwe, and I was talking about lithium and how Zimbabwe is the largest producer of lithium in Africa. But I'm not sure if my government is aware because yeah, there are issues to do with corruption and the financial flows. But because of those issues, then we're not able to realize the value that we would get from that lithium producing. So that is the challenge that we have. So many countries do have specialties that they could look into, but because of certain barriers, some which are more inward than outward, it would be a problem to specialize on that. So it's one of the things that I do mention in my paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the question was how do we regulate for crypto, considering that it's very volatile. And I think the approach that Japan has taken, which is actually in the paper, I didn't have time to get to it, is a great example because they have had $100 million And the approach that they take is that they regulate on an industry basis. So it's more, if I can say, more zoned in. And I think that kind of approach would be important and can be applied in Africa. So it's not just a general policy approach, but it's more zoned in per industry.
Excellent. Just come and give them a round of applause again.